is Eileen Wold. I'm here towards the end of my 2024 residency at the Desert Dairy. I started my time here wandering around the grounds as I did the first time I visited, taking in the landscape and trying to absorb as much as I could about where I was. The first thing in this visit that really struck me were the patterns of the creosotes that dotted the landscape. And it's such an interesting, unusual way that they sit on the horizon. I also had been researching them a little bit coming in about their use in the desert as a carbon sink and how important they are to the ecology of the landscape, but more importantly, in my opinion, is their ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and lock it sort of deep down underground. In my practice, I think a lot about the equivalency of the amount of carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere with what's required to bring it back down into the ground. So we call that the carbon sink. Square meter of mature forest, of old growth, can absorb a gallon of oil back into the ground. So if we are extracting carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere, we can create a carbon sink balance if we think of those square meters. That equivalency struck me as really interesting because it's about my size. Like if I sit on the ground, I kind of occupy a square meter. And I thought about that in terms of our human scale, and this big, overwhelming global phenomenon of the carbon sink shrunk down into my size was super fascinating. So I spent some time over the years visiting different types of carbon sinks around the planet, especially around the United States. And coming to the desert landscape here, the creosote is such an interesting and important part of that carbon sink equivalency. So here at the Desert Dairy, I started measuring out some square meters around certain creosotes and their partners. So sometimes it's a single, sometimes here there's two that are related to one another. And I created little responses visually to that idea. For example, this creosote pairing, I wanted to create the square meter with basalt rock, which is sort of this light volcanic rock that is being used sort of in an experimental way right now with some geoengineering of crushing this into powder, putting it on large in stripes down fields as a way to absorb carbon. Some minerals and rocks can actually absorb quite a bit of carbon back out of the atmosphere. There's one behind it here where I wanted to highlight the square meter in sort of a positive space. This time I illustrated the square with a calcite sand. It's sort of a cooling, whiter sand than what you'll normally find here in the desert. Here are 3 square meters that I've sort of outlined here together because I wanted to think about, it's not just one sort of square meter that we're looking at a time. It's really a grid of them, and it's acres of old growth forest that we're either deforesting and taking away or that we're planting or preserving. And so I wanted to show sort of those stages together. I wanted to make an illustration around this creosote. It was a bit larger than some of the others I found in this area, and it had me wondering how old each of these plants were. So when I researched how do we date these plants, it's carbon dating, but also they have tree rings. Just like you would date an old growth forest in a more traditional way, you would count the tree rings in one of these as well. So I wanted to create some rings to sort of signify around that square meter equivalency size that, you know, we can tell how old some of these old growth clusters are. And some of them are 11,000 years old. So that was really fascinating to me in terms of how long they've been here. This drawing in the landscape, I wanted to talk about how interesting it is how they shoot out. Creosotes will reproduce by shooting out and then forming into the land a new plant. And they grow in clusters and rings. And some of these clusters and rings we know to be thousands of years old. And actually the oldest living creosote ring that we know about is just not too far from here. We went this morning to go explore it and to see it for ourselves. It's 11,000 years old. And I thought how interesting that they survived through all of that time and that their relatives are so close to them. They stay within these circular clusters. Part of my process is drawing with pencil and paper, as most artists do. I'm sketching as I'm thinking through these big complex ideas, but I'm also sketching out in the landscape. And I know that with these sketches, they'll disappear over time. And we had a big sandstorm come through during my time here at the Desert Dairy. So I got to witness some of that entropy in real time, which was much more than I anticipated. And I really enjoyed coming back out here after this sandstorm had died down and saw that it blurred all of the white calcite lines that I had created. And I love the poetry of that. I'm really excited I got to witness it here. Eventually, they will disappear completely. And I think that the square meters are always there, whether we can see them, whether I'm illustrating them for you or not. And so hopefully that process of disintegration as it dissolves into the wind highlights that.